questions. My name is Cassandra Etienne. I'm Assistant Director at the Center for Cooperative Media. In just a moment, we'll get started with this event on upcoming races in New Jersey, the state's changing voter demographics, and issues of concern to New Jerseyans, including campaign ad messaging, historic inflation rates, redistricting, and more. Today's event is part of the Not Your Same Old Sources series, which features experts from our diverse sources database. It's a publicly available, sortable list of experts of different races, genders, ages, and ethnicities. This panel is presented by the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University in partnership with NJ.com, New Jersey Ethnic and Community Media, and our event sponsor, Princeton University's Office of Communications. A big thank you to our host, Tom Moran, editorial page editor and columnist for the Star Ledger, and our special invited guests who you'll meet shortly. They are Dr. Linda Caldwell-Epps, President and CEO of 1804 Consultants, David A. Matos Jr., career public servant and former New Jersey State Administrator, and Peter Chen, Senior Policy Analyst for the New Jersey Policy Perspective. Thanks again to you all for joining us, and now I'll turn it over to my colleague Joe Amditis for some additional announcements to help ensure that today's event runs as smoothly as possible.
Yes, thank you so much, Cassandra. Folks, you know the drill, a Zoom event here. We got Zoom meetings, so you can post your questions or comments. You can introduce yourself in the chat. Just make sure you're addressing that to everyone and you don't have it selected as a DM. If you have any trouble hearing or there are any issues, we are turning on closed captions right now. So feel free to click the closed captions button down there to follow along on your screen. If you have any issues or problems, you can just send me a DM on Zoom here and I'll try to work with you behind the scenes to get it set up. With that, I think we're good to go. Tom, why don't we go ahead and bring you up and you can introduce yourself and our panelists. And we're going to ask you to unmute. Tom, you are muted, so we're just going to have you unmute. Yep.
I'm sorry. So yeah, I work as editorial page editor at the Star Ledger and write a column. So we've been covering the midterms pretty thoroughly. I thought I'd just start off with a sort of big picture. There are 12 seats in New Jersey, as you all probably know. When Donald Trump was elected, they were split 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats. And now, because Donald Trump has not gone down well in New Jersey, it's 10 Democrats and 2 Republicans. And they're almost all safe, fairly safe seats in New Jersey. There are 4 that we have focused on, and those are the 4 that Democrats have taken from Republicans since 2016. And that's Josh Gottheimer, who won in 2016, and 3 others who won in 2018, Mikey Sherrill, Tom Malinowski, and Andy Kim. So the way the Cook Political Report has this race going is there are nationally, if you have 435 seats, only 31 of them are rated as toss-ups, none in New Jersey. The Republicans have a great advantage because most of those toss-ups are held by Democrats. So they are expected to win, as I'm sure we all know. In those 4 districts that I mentioned for New Jersey, Mikey Sherrill is the one who has pulled out the biggest lead and is now considered by Cook Political Report to be a solid Democratic district. And that also reflects the redistricting that took place this year. They gave Mikey Sherrill a lot more Democratic votes. Josh Gottheimer running against Frank Pallotta is likely Democrat, and Andy Kim running against Bob Healy is also likely Democrat. The only one that leans Republican is Tom Malinowski's seat. He's being challenged, as I'm sure you all know, by former State Senator Tom Kaine Jr., and that one leans Republican. That's very close too. So from our point of view, you know, of course, I know we're all different types of media here, but we try to cover the statewide. We had 12 districts and it didn't seem rational to spend our time in all these other 8 that are solid, one party or the other, so we focus most of our efforts on these 4. And we've, you know, interviewed everybody as much as we can. We're getting unusual, unprecedented, actually, lack of cooperation from Republican candidates who just don't want to talk to us. I think they've seen our reporting on all things Trump. We sent all 4 Republican candidates a list of questions at the outset related to Trump and January 6th and the big lie and all this stuff. And we got answers from only one of the 4, even in writing. But I think that helps explain why they don't want to come in and sit down with us. And I'm telling you, that's unusual. That is a product of today's polarization, because it really didn't, you know, I've been in this job for 20 years and I've never seen it before. And I regard it as really sad. If you probably have seen the worst offender on this is Tom Kean Jr. He won't answer any questions in writing or say where he stands on anything. He hasn't held any town hall meetings. He's not sitting down with editorial boards anywhere. So I think he has done actually a couple of small ones, but generally is giving the big middle finger to the press. So that leaves us in a difficult spot. So that's sort of the lay of the land politically right now. Why don't we could talk about, the panel just discussed before, and we want to get to questions from you guys relatively early in this process, but let's go through some of the big issues first. And why don't we kick that off, Peter, with you from New Jersey policy perspective. Peter Chen. We have, I forgot to introduce David.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. David Matos, who is this longtime work policy guy in the State House. Peter Chen and Dr. Linda Caldwell Epps, as you said. So Peter, why don't you kick us up on where you see the flashpoints on issues here? Either the most potent politically or the most important substantively.
Well, I think it's actually quite hard to answer this question, because if you look at polls, people will say inflation, jobs, economy is at the top of the list. And I think generally speaking, it's the economy, stupid has been the story of elections for a long time. But the very deep polarization that you already mentioned makes it very difficult to read. So for example, if you look at polling of like how people feel the economy is doing broken down by political party, and you look at when Biden was sworn in, the party responses to that question flip entirely, right? All Democrats suddenly think the economy is doing great. All Republicans think that the economy is in the toilet. So, I think it's very hard to read just from polling alone, where some of the flashpoints are. I do think that one obvious issue, and one that NJPP has worked on at the state level, is abortion access. And this will continue to be a major issue, especially for a state like New Jersey, where the bulk of the electorate supports a woman's right to choose. Republican legislators and candidates have to walk a fine line of doing just enough, saying just enough to make it appear that they're not abortion extremists, while continuing to make those points to a Republican primary electorate, and make sure that their base is supportive of them for exactly the kind of media bubble issues that you identify. Right? You don't have to show up to the Star Ledger anymore, because you have an entire media ecosystem to yourself that you can just keep hammering your views on and avoid, any independent scrutiny.
Although I think it helps for them. I once asked John Schur, who is Jim Florio's right-hand man, I said, so John, tell me, what difference do editorials make? And he goes, there are only two things that matter about an editorial to politicians. One is whether you can use it in a TV ad, and the other is whether your opponent can use it in a TV ad, which as a writer was quite depressing to hear. But you do see them use this stuff quite a bit. The twist we've had this year, if I may just add one entertaining little sidelight, is we wrote an editorial critical of Kean, saying whatever Trump does, Kean has his back. He took that criticism and made it into a mailer. The Republican campaign committee did. So it was actually proud of the fact that whatever Trump does, he has his back. These are extraordinary times, but Peter, can I follow up on abortion too? I know a lot of political consultants who say it's not that big an issue. And if you saw the recent New York Times Siena poll, only 5% rated it as their top issue. My friend Julie Roginski, who's a Democratic consultant who's run a bunch of campaigns from Lautenberg and Booker. She originally started Murphy's. She says Democrats making a big mistake on this, thinking that this is going to drive votes.
Tom, I'm not sure I agree with my dear friend Julie on that point. And you can wonder why Democrats are focusing so heavily on reproductive rights when the polls are showing that the economy is the number one issue on voters' minds. But number one, the economy, when the economy is not going well in people's minds, it's never a good issue for Democrats. It's always been an issue that Republicans can bank on. But more importantly, I think in this election cycle, the number one issue among women is reproductive rights. It's not the economy. So I think that, and among Democratic women, obviously it's higher. And women outvote men. We know that that's been going on in this country since 1980 or so. So, so we know that this is an important issue for women voters, and it's a motivating issue for women voters. At least that's what the Democrats are counting on. And I think the Democratic strategy here is to push that issue and generate that women's vote, particularly suburban women, and make a difference.
Yeah, and if
If
we
I-
look at
Oh,
go
If
ahead.
I may
Panelists.
interject.
Go ahead, Dr. Epps.
Yeah.
Linda, please.
Yes. I really feel that our overall problem is lack of understanding how this whole process works, and a lack of appreciation for how important it is that we work through our government structures to affect change. And I know that you've all probably heard this before, but I think that one of the biggest mistakes that we made in public education was removing civics from the curriculum.
Yeah.
Because I honestly and truly believe that people do not understand to the fullest extent how much their vote really counts, how much they're not only listening to media, but reading and discerning what is written in our print media to understand the times, the political system, our historical culture about voting. I think that that's where we're missing things. I'm really very worried and very saddened about the intellectual capacity of people to really understand our electoral process.
Yeah, I think about that. Half the country believes the big lie.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And I think it's I think it's our educational system has done us a disservice by not being more rigorous and by about examining what they should be teaching and how they should be teaching it more than anything else. I think our analytical thinking skills are shot here because who in their right mind could have followed, it could be a follower of the Republican Party. I'm sorry, I'm showing my bias in this day and age, given what we just went through for 4 years.
Should we talk about inflation, which is number one issue by most accounts? David, if I could say, I don't know how, I know these polls are all very different, but if I could just add on abortion before we leave that, I don't know how you could have only 5% in the New York Times CNN poll, considering that the top issue, if it is the top issue for women. So this gets into, exactly what poll and how the question was asked and all that sort of thing, I guess.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the Eagleton poll specifically for New Jersey that was released yesterday, I think, or the day before. And my comment, because my experience is overwhelmingly New Jersey politics, so I'm focused on the state.
Right.
And in New Jersey, I think that's definitely the Democratic strategy. They're going to push that issue to push out a heavy vote among women and use that to try to carry their race.
So if you look at the 7th district where Malinowski and Kane are fighting it out, the one, as I said, that leans Republican, that is a particularly affluent and well-educated district where that issue is likely to play more than in other districts. So
that and guns. Yeah. I think that you can say the same for guns when it comes to the strategic intent of the Democratic campaigns.
Okay, how about inflation? Anybody have any thoughts on how that is covered and what role that's going to play? So I can kick it off if nobody. Go ahead, Peter.
I mean, I think it is very hard to read like what an electoral response inflation is, especially because how one personally experiences inflation is very related to the particular bundle of goods that you purchase, right? And so if you're feeling the pinch of inflation because you've just received a rent notice that your rent is going up 40%, right? Inflation is going to matter a lot more to you as an issue than if you're, I don't know, let's say you're a single male in their 20s who's, experiencing the record low prices of televisions and smartphones, right? Like, I think there are differences in like the bundle of goods that people purchase. And so much of what people perceive about inflation is this sort of, for lack of a better word, the vibes of inflation. And as David noted, when people feel certain kinds of economic issues are going badly, they reflexively vote against the incumbent party in power, right? I think that's the historical trend. But again, I think it's very hard to read given the amount of polarization. So, for example, jobs and unemployment is up there on issues that I think in the Monmouth poll recently and a number of other polls, jobs unemployment keeps coming up. Unemployment is historically low, right? Jobs, there are too many jobs. There are not enough people to fill all the jobs. And yet, disproportionately Republicans are very concerned about jobs and unemployment. So I think it's hard to read like what exactly this will mean. But broadly speaking, I would say, there's some risk of an anti-incumbent sentiment. But the weird thing here is it's not like, we keep hearing, particularly from Republican candidates, inflation, but there's not like there's a plan to address the inflation, because it turns out addressing inflation is very hard. Like, it's not like the Federal Reserve and, the president are not trying to address inflation. And it's not clear, certainly something like tax cuts would not help inflation, it would actually make inflation worse. So the Republican sort of toolbox is kind of empty there as well.
Tom, if I may, David, Tom Malinowski just made this point in his debate before the New Jersey Globe with Tom Kean Jr. He said to Tom Kean Jr., "You're running on the problem, not on the solution," which I think is true. We have canvassed all four in those districts, all the Republicans, asking them to discuss inflation. And two of the four got on the phone to discuss it, and neither of them really had any answers to it either. Exactly as you're saying, Peter. The solution is for the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates, and everyone hates that because it slows down the economy and tanks the stock market. But if there's a better answer, I haven't heard it out there.
I'll tell you who thinks inflation is going to be a big issue in this election: the Saudis.
Yeah.
All right. And I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, but gas prices are going down 6 weeks before the midterms. Democrats start to whisper, hey, this could be good for us in November. All of a sudden, boom, the Saudis cut back production, gas prices go back up.
That's
and
right.
now people are starting to feel that gas crunch again at the pump, and inflation now comes forefront in people's minds. So, but to me, it begs the question, what drives voters in these midterm congressional elections? Is it issues? Is it really issues? Is it the candidates? Is it civics? Is it party loyalty? Just what motivates voters to come out? And we know that these elections are notoriously low turnout elections.
Linda, did you want to add something in there?
I was just going to agree. I was going to offer that it's the personality of the candidate that's running. And again, it's that day-to-day, what is impacting your life and your lifestyle. And again, I'll go with the civics, because we don't have a thorough understanding of how this works. And for years, we did not play up the importance of these midterm elections, these sort of off-year elections. And I don't think that people are in the habit yet of voting every year. It's the presidential election that seems to be important, and that's it. And everything that happens, it's whoever is in power, it's their fault. It doesn't matter, I think, to rank and file people whether the solution is presented or not, because they're not going to understand how that solution is going to work and personally impact them. They have to actually see the numbers go up and down. I like that you mentioned the gas prices. I was driving on Saturday and filled my car up, and for the first time recognized how much gas had gone up during the past 2 or 3 weeks. And I said something to the attendant, who just shrugged his shoulders and said, we should have known that this was going to happen. So it was, that drop was too fast and too good. Election time, we can expect anything to happen.
I'll go you one better. It's not even so much that the congressional elections people don't feel that they're that
Mhm.
important to the public. I don't think they're that important to the political infrastructure in the state.
Mhm.
I've been involved in campaigns in New Jersey since 1978, dating myself, but and I can tell you that most the only interest, I think, not the only interest, the major focus of the who's in the congressional delegation in New Jersey is who's likely to run for governor. I mean, you know, in New Jersey, governor is the whole show. Tom, you can weigh in on that if you agree or disagree. But, you know, in New Jersey, it's all about the governorship. And, you know, people are looking at this year's congressional races, I think, more in terms of, you know, who's lining up to run for governor in 3 years.
Yeah, I think that's true. And you're hearing a lot of talk about Mikey Sherrill or Josh Gottheimer maybe running for governor.
Gottheimer's got $14 million in his campaign account unspent right now.
Who does? Josh Gottheimer?
Yeah, 14 million.
Right.
I'd say that's a pretty safe bet, Ben, that he's running.
So one thing that's probably worth
Shocked
mentioning
me,
here
David, what you're
too.
saying.
Oh,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
Peter, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, one thing that's also happening is the sort of end of the moderate, the moderate representative, right? There's no Frank Lobiandos left, right? And you know, an easy way to look at this is to look at Jeff Andrews' party switch, right? He went from voting Dem 90% of the time to voting R 90% of the time, and you know, that the kind of both because of how Congress works, but also because of the increasing pressure on primary elections, means that, you know, there's just more polarization, and so people people who are voting say, hey, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. 6 of 1, they're going to do the same thing. But functionally, the parties are very different now than they have been historically, and even than they were, let's say, during 2008 or 2010. Right? These are the parties have consolidated ideologically in a way that means your vote is much more important. Right? The difference functionally between Kane or Malinowski is enormous. Their votes are going to be entirely polarized. Whereas the difference between Lobiando and Van Drew, you know, it probably went from, you know, 70% Republican to 70% Democrat, right?
Yeah, you could see the change in the Republican Party from Tom Kane Sr. to Tom Kane Jr. Tom Kane Sr. declares President Trump to be unfit for office.
Yes.
Calls his behavior on January 6th a dereliction of duty. And Tom Kane Jr. stands next to Kevin McCarthy when he announces his campaign and says, I'll have Trump's back no matter what. It's really quite striking. And he has 2 websites, Tom Kane Jr. One is the public one. If you Google Tom Kane for Congress, you'll see. Another you have to be sent the URL to, and it has far more right-wing positions on it about the sanctity of life and backing the police no matter what, all this sort of thing.
Hell,
So-
you can see the change from Tom Kane Jr. to Tom Kane Jr. You don't have to go back as far as senior.
That's a very good point, David. He used to be that sort of centrist Republican.
Yeah.
I think if you what I resist, Peter, when I hear that, which I agree with you 100%, but it's not happening to both parties at the same degree. If you look at the 4 Democrats, if you look at Mikey Sherrill, Josh Gottheimer, Tom Malinowski, Andy Kim, in those districts, they're all moderate Democrats. They could be perfectly comfortable with the Bill Clinton type, you know, a triangulator or somebody like that. Whereas when you look to the Republican side, the change has been dramatic. The New Jersey, as we all know, used to be a bastion for that sort of moderate Republican, the Tom Kane Sr., Christy Whitman. Look at Christy Whitman. She's now devoting her life to beating Trump somehow. And it's the Republican Party that is really polarized. The Democrats, we've seen on the Democratic side, the emergence of like the Squad and Bernie Sanders, where you do have a faction, but that faction is decidedly in the minority. And there was always that faction within the Democratic Party. Look at Bernie Sanders. He's been there for 40 years as a socialist. But this is really a change that's happening on the Republican side, if you ask me, primarily.
What I'm curious, because you brought up the Squad, and you haven't heard much from those members of Congress in the last 18 months or so. What's going on with them? Has the Speaker put them in line now? Are they more mature in their office holding lives that they understand that being crazy is not necessarily doesn't necessarily work in your favor. What's going on there?
That's a good question. I mean, I'd open it up. I just say that we did see a lot of centrist Democrats more likely to win primary races, as opposed to centrist Republicans are all losing. Centrist Democrats are all winning, not all, but mostly, because AOC's district is very far to the left, so it's not a typical district. And she voted against the infrastructure bill. That's when she lost me. That's crazy. I thought. Because it didn't do enough about climate, I think was her argument. I'm not 100% sure, but that's one of the few successful governmental bipartisan, made a huge deal to New Jersey, and it just seemed immature politically to me.
So one thing I think we want to be careful though with is that, this is an increase, particularly in New Jersey, an increasingly racially and ethnically diverse electorate, and many new generations are entering the electorate. And certainly the polling suggests that they lean farther left, even than old geriatric millennials like me. And we haven't necessarily seen, elected officials engage this group actively. Maybe for some of the reasons that you raised, that they're concerned about appearing too far left. But, if we take, for example, my district here with the retiring Albio Osiris, and with Rob Menendez, poised to win his election, this, I don't know. I think there's a good question about there's an unknown about what the issues are that are motivating this age range, and particularly because this is a group that has been, young people are historically low turnout populations. Like, what are the issues that can help engage them and integrate them into an electorate? I think this goes back to what Dr. Caldwell-Epps was saying about civics education, but also has to do with the way that the electoral system has not been set up historically to be sort of friendly to young voters.
Linda, what do you think?
I think that once we resolve, or at least have some idea of what this next generation coming up, what would interest them, we're probably game finally for maybe the start of a third party. I've been waiting for that for a long time to happen, that we have an alternate choice between Democrats and Republicans. And I think it's this next generation of voters that's coming that's going to bring that. I'd like to hear
you avoid, Linda, the problem, unless you have ranked voting. What about the problem, which is tougher on presidential, that if you do have a Green Party candidate, it winds up electing the Republican? Because that's happened over and over. It happened with Joe, obviously, with Al Gore.
Yeah.
And it happened, it's happened a couple of times. I mean, you could argue a lot of states that happens.
So then this brings, I question our whole structure, a whole political structure here, that you're either or. There, there, in talking with people, there are people who are in the middle, and who are not exactly liberal Democrats, and they're not exactly conservative Republicans. They really are someplace in the middle. Where is an opportunity for a voice for those people?
Well, Christy Whitman and Andrew Yang have started a party for aiming at just that group.
And how, how's it going? You guys would know better than me. I knew about Christy Whitman's attempts there.
Yeah, I don't think it's going much of anywhere.
That's the problem.
I asked her about this problem of what happens if you wind up electing you draw off some liberal votes and you wind up electing the conservative because you split the Democratic liberal vote. And she said they're not going to run candidates in districts where they fear that's a risk. So I don't know what that says about the presidential election, but I think she's.
Again, I think the party infrastructure in the United States is just too strong. Like when you think about independent candidates who run, you look at Evan McMullin in Utah, right? He's running as Democrat this time, right? Like I think there's the party infrastructure is strong, and there's a reason why the political parties have been so durable, because we have a first past the post election system. But I think this question about how to engage young voters and thinking about the kinds of issues that matter to them is important, especially because of one thing that was raised in the chat here, which is, polling, especially random digit dialing polling, is just, the response rates are nothing. I mean, you could be on for 2 hours and get one response. And so I think there's a very poor understanding of what young voters are looking for. And there are issues that are just going to matter more to young voters. Think about something like climate change. Tom, I know you make a joke sometimes that you've been at the Ledger since the Civil War. But a young voter has a lot of future ahead of them that climate change is going to impact their lives, the lives of their children, their grandchildren. And I think that probably has a lot more salience to them, but that's not going to show up in polling, right? And that's not going to show up in campaigning necessarily. So I do think there's a broad question about, how those issues, the issues of young people, are going to be addressed by electoral politics.
Yeah.
The energy that we saw out in the streets during the spring and summer of 2020, which I understand people were self-reported as being protesting in record numbers. Where is all that energy these days? Where do they go with that? I mean, it's sort of fizzled down as it usually always does. But something happened during that time period. And I really wonder what happened to all those voices that were out there. And it wasn't just against race, it was against the entire structure of what we're doing here. And I really was hopeful that that would carry into more structured institutions within our society, that energy would remain. And I just don't see it anymore.
No, you do not. It's true, Linda. I think, well, it's funny because you mentioned the importance of civics education. And I think in the George Floyd case, you didn't need an education to be moved emotionally by seeing them murder this guy. I mean, that was just emotional. I think that gave it that I'm going to the demonstration Saturday kind of attitude for a lot of people. We haven't, it's hard, almost impossible to match that, Inflation certainly doesn't do it. Even I've been wondering all years why climate change didn't get more resonance, but it's such a relief now.
Right.
I also think that young voters are frustrated by the polarization in politics today. I think they look at both extremes arguing. There's constant debate in the media, and it's extremism on one side in particular, and maybe some on the other side, and going back and forth. And I think young people look at that and throw up their hands and say, why bother?
Yeah. I think that we are discredited, at least my generation, in the eyes of a lot of young people because of climate change and because of racial injustice that's so glaring. And at least I get that from my daughter. On both those things, they're like, where have you been? What were you doing?
Right, but they can do something about it, as Dr. Caldwell says, but they're not, and that's, I think that's the fundamental question. Why? And then the follow up is, how do we get them to engage?
I have to work on that with my daughter, but that's my story.
Well, maybe you can work on that with your employer as well.
In what regard?
Campaign to educate young voters, go into schools, promoting civics, editorial campaign to promote civics and promote civic engagement and voting among young people. There's lots that news media is not dead.
You were all the political pundits. So how is that age group, other than protesting, expressing their desire or their disappointment in our generation, and well, actually, and generations under us, about leaving these issues, which are important, and we're finding out more and more how important climate change is. How do they expect to change if they're not willing to work towards it? I don't have access to that age group too much. My children are, I'm older than all of you, my children are above that in age. But how do they see their world shaping up? If not through the vote, how do they think that change is going to occur?
So one thing I want to flag for New Jersey is,
Mhm.
again, going back to the strength of the local political parties. No, the line is not, all powerful, but I think it goes without saying that local party organizations have very strong sway over the nominees for their party primaries and largely set the table there. And I think that feeling of, well, my vote doesn't count, right? Again, thinking about my district and the way that every major Democrat in the state lined up to endorse Rob Menendez before he announced that he was going to run, right? Like it can make young voters, again, in a district that is as Democratic leaning as AOC's district, can make young voters say, well, what's the point, right? Like I'm just punching for something that's a foregone conclusion, right? And again, like the line is not the be all and end all, but it's obviously at least symbolic of the power that the local parties continue to have over the selection process that makes it feel like the public is being shut out. Again, certainly people who defend the line would say that it's, the public can sure turn out in a primary and plenty of people win off the line, but not a lot of people win off the line, and plenty of incumbents get bumped, despite whatever political following they may have. So I think that we're seeing it elsewhere, right? We're seeing it in unionization efforts, right? We're seeing it in sort of small p political power outside of the electoral system.
Okay.
But I think it's because when looking at the system, the impact of one vote, right, in especially in a district like mine, which is is a foregone conclusion, feels like, well, what's the point, right? And it doesn't even start with like local politics. Like how much are you going to engage someone who's mayor of Clifton, right? Which you should, but I think it's much harder to engage.
Yep.
Peter, I agree with your point, but I think using Hudson County as the example is too extreme.
I'm here too, Peter. It does feel a little like, anyway, let's switch over to some questions. We have about 20 minutes left. I'd like to hear what other people who are watching this have anything to say. So you could address your questions to the group broadly or to one of us.
Yeah, feel free to raise your hand and I'll request for you to unmute and I'll spotlight your video. Or if you can want to post your questions in the chat, then we can read them out loud for our panelists.
Just one last thought while we wait on that next generation. It seems to me, and maybe this is just anecdotal, but that young people are choosing careers that have them doing something meaningful more often than just going out to make money. And so maybe being turned off to politics doesn't mean you're giving up on society and improving things. It's just one avenue, really.
I'd like to believe that's true. I hope you're right about that.
Yeah.
Katrina Jenko wants to know if either of you had any comments on school board races in New Jersey, and what are some issues that people should pay attention to there, races, and what's the coverage and reporting atmosphere like?
I'll tell you what concerns me about school board. I mean, there's too many school board races and candidates across the state to really follow in that way. But I'll tell you what concerns me is what I hear about groups like the Proud Boys and other radical right groups that are now focusing on school board elections and getting members elected to local school boards, and then going on to do things like banning books from school libraries and dictating what needs to come out of curriculum and what kinds of what kind of textbooks are going to be used, et cetera. So that concerns me about school board elections. And all I can say about that is that people need to really pay attention and find out who the candidates are and question them thoroughly and vet them thoroughly before casting votes.
There is no area, I think, that is more damaged by the decline of the press than school board coverage. We don't have the coverage. It's very hard for me to write editorials because nobody's covering the school board meetings. And it's particularly bad because right now this has been a hot button issue where extremists are trying to grab the microphone. And I don't think most people are as crazy about, say the discussion we're having about sex ed in the younger grades. I think it's a legitimate concern. At what age do you start to teach kids about homosexuality and gender differences? So it's a reasonable discussion. Most people recognize that and are saying, okay, let's do this by first grade and third grade and fifth grade. And then you got these crazies, mostly on the right, who are saying like they're trying to indoctrinate and recruit and groom our children. The fact that there is so little coverage of what's actually going on in the district these days really hurts. And we have, there's another bill in pending in the legislature that would, the bill would stop the Labor Department from forcing another regulation that's going to kill newspapers, where you have to treat all newspaper delivery people as employees, even if they work 2 hours a day. And that's going to be, the Star Ledger is going to lose about $3 million. So we'll fire some more reporters and we'll have even less coverage of local school boards. This is the part where it really bleeds, I think, that the loss of media coverage.
We got another question from the chat. What are some of the issues on the ground, specifically for immigrants and people of color, voters in the state, issues that would drive them to the polls, or are you seeing responses or energy around?
So, I mean, I mentioned the sort of diversity of the state, and I think there's a lot of diversity within immigrant populations as well. And I think a lot depends on the economic situation of immigrant voters. And I think that's where reporting really comes in, right? Of talking directly to folks, especially in non-English languages, about what are the issues that matter to them. And I think for many immigrant families, it's the same sort of checkbook kitchen table issues that affect everyone. So issues like rising food prices, rising rent prices really matter. And, thinking about I don't necessarily know, right? Like that there are ways that we can, certainly polling is particularly weak among this population, right? They're less likely to answer the phone. They're less likely to speak English as a native language. They're less likely to have a landline. So, I think there are some real challenges with getting information about, immigrant voters, and they're a growing part of the population and are an increasingly large voting bloc. There was a report from that Alliance for Immigrant Justice and Make the Road have been working on that talks about sort of the growth in immigrant voting power, but that this is a group that's poorly understood, and economic issues do seem to dominate, but not entirely.
That actually dovetails right into Claybel Marcano of Report de Hispano. He has a question that says, in the midterm elections, talk about the power of the Hispanic community in particular in a competitive district and the difference that can make in the results or not. Is that important? And what kind of methods or tactics have you seen that have worked to motivate these groups where many of the specific communities, issues important to those communities aren't often discussed in campaigns?
I can speak a little bit to that. I think it is a critical portion of the electorate and critical in a lot of key elections. But my issue with the Democratic Party in particular over the years has been the failure of the party to engage the Latino community in between elections. You constantly hear that, you guys only come around in the middle of October, just before the election, and ask for our vote. But in between, we never hear from you. We never see you. We're not given opportunities to engage. Part of that goes back to Peter's point about the local party structures and who runs things at the local level and the county level, and how open are those mechanisms to Latinos from the community. Another thing is we haven't talked about, nobody's mentioned crime yet today. And for urban voters, you see the Republicans are using crime as a wedge issue because that's an area of real concern to Latinos, African Americans who live in urban areas where crime, particular street crime, shootings. We have the toughest gun laws in the country. Governor Murphy's always saying, maybe he's right. Nonetheless, there's a lot of gun violence going on in our urban areas in particular. And I live in Burlington County, and we're starting to see it more in suburban areas as well. But these are largely minority communities that are being impacted, and nobody seems to be the current governments don't seem to be able to get a real handle on things. Like I said, the Republicans see that, and they're using it as a way to reach out to Latino voters in particular, And they're being successful that way.
We got a question
A
from.
way to
oh, go
reach
ahead.
out, but again, without any kind of plan to make things better. I mean, they may address the issue in that Democrats are not taking care of it, but with no real plan, and that I've heard anyway.
Yeah, but when you're running against an incumbent, you don't have to have a plan.
It doesn't matter.
You just have to say they're crummy, and you got to get rid of them and put me in because I'm better.
Yeah, it doesn't
But I've
matter.
seen from some, just one last word on this topic is before, I think, Joe, you have another question, but the assumption that Latinos care deeply about immigration or care most about immigration is, from what my Democratic consultant type friends are saying, is not true.
Right.
That it's pocketbook stuff, crime, that kind of basic stuff too.
No different than your average New Jersey voter.
Yeah.
We have a question from Zhongwen Li of Yonhap News Agency. He says the Asian population in New Jersey has increased dramatically recently, alongside the increase of harassment against Asian people and Asian residents. Why do you all think this hasn't played out or plays out in very few, stories and or stump speeches with among candidates?
So I can try to address this one. I think this has to do with the way that diversity sort of plays out among the congressional districts. This goes back to redistricting. But the Asian community in particular is diffuse across the state. There are concentrations in some pockets, but broadly speaking, each district has, I don't know, between 5 and 15%, Asian population. Some have slightly higher, but, and I think campaigns are still, unfortunately, in a world where they're sort of targeting broadly rather than targeting, smaller but vocal groups that want to take part in the electoral process and that have historically not necessarily been included. And when there's that extra step that's needed, Spanish language outreach, right, or English language outreach to Latino and Hispanic voters, right? That just it takes a long time to ramp up. It's not ready. And so I will say that Representative Gottheimer has made a bit more of a public stance on hate crimes against Asians, but again, his district has a higher percentage Asian. And so, even if we think about Andy Kim, who is an Asian American representative, his district is only what, 8%, 7% Asian. And so, that doesn't necessarily, I mean, although he has spoken, eloquently and passionately about this issue, it sort of fades into the noise of election season, which is, sort of settles on a few narratives and just hammers them home. But those are good questions to ask people in those communities about whether they vote, why they vote, and whether those would be motivating issues for them, because they might not be, right? Similar to the way that immigration might not be a motivating issue for Hispanic or Latino voters, depending on their own situation.
Right.
Peter, I'm going to disagree with you on one point. I think that kind of communication is ready. There are Latino consultants, there are Latino communicators, media people who are very skilled, ready, willing, and able to do this work, this campaign work, but they're not getting the opportunities. The campaigns still are not understanding the value or the need for that. So I would say that it's not a question of readiness. It's a question of when will they get the access.
Okay, I just want to note we have about 9 minutes until the top of the hour. We are scheduled until 3 o'clock, but we do have some overflow time if the conversation keeps going. Now is the time to drop your final questions in the chat, or if you'd like to ask them out loud, again, you can use the raised hand feature under the reactions button. That should allow you to just raise your hand like I just did, and then we'll call on you to unmute. Are there any issues that we haven't talked about, just for the panelists? Anything that we haven't talked about this during this event that you think is important for people to focus on in their coverage as they prepare for the election? Any particular issue or tactic?
Just the survival of our democracy. We haven't talked about that much.
Yes.
I do think that's at stake, and it was very disturbing. And the Times Siena poll I mentioned earlier also showed that, yeah, something like 2/3 of Americans say, yes, our democracy is in danger, but for almost no one is it a top issue. So that's the combination of those things is very disturbing. And there was another article in the same today about how conservatives have extreme conservatives like Steve Bannon is organizing armies of poll watchers. And that's something I hope that every journalist in New Jersey keeps careful eye on. We have a terrible legacy of that in New Jersey, as you guys, I'm sure, all know on the panel, that the Republican National Committee, when Kane beat Florio, sent off-duty cops with security armbands to polling stations where they put up signs saying, if you have any, outstanding warrants, you can't vote, and just if you vote falsely, you can go to jail. And that was resulted in a big lawsuit and settlement. That settlement was recently lifted. So now it expired. So the situation at the polls in this election is going to be really volatile and critical for people to be there covering it.
Interestingly, the Eagleton poll that I mentioned before cited hyperpartisanship as the #2 issue on the minds of New Jersey Latino voters.
Mm.
We have a question in the chat here about more local climate issues. I mean, we touched briefly on climate as a topic of sort of horse race coverage. But with regard to New Jersey in particular, how have you seen, what about the coverage around these issues, flooding, especially in low income communities, the dune replacements, the big contract that just was signed with the Army Corps of Engineers, dozens of billions of dollars to this. Have you seen this kind of coverage enter into the election and the electoral conversation? And if so, in what capacity?
I'm depressed that it's not a bigger issue and that the Democrats are not getting credit for the bill they did. I just went to a clean energy conference down in Atlantic City and heard Jesse Jenkins from Princeton Institute on Climate, or I forget the formal name of it, but talk about this bill and how it basically, anything you do green, whether it's build a solar plant or buy an electric car or insulate your home, is now half price. You get credits and tax credits for all that stuff. And it's a dramatic step that Democrats are getting almost no credit for. It's shocking to me.
Well, I think one of the challenges with climate is that it has these sort of like spikes of disaster-based sort of flooding or emergencies, but that it's a long game. And the current sort of electoral media ecosystem is not built to talk about issues that are long game issues, right? Apologies, Tom, but I do think it's the reality, and particularly in a world that's more dominated by, clickbaity kind of news, I think it's harder to talk about, but I do think that some of the folks, especially those representing shore districts, certainly, yes, they are speaking about it, but it's often, tempered by the political realities of the partisanship of those districts.
It seems to me the media is paying a lot more attention to this than the population. In other words, we're already, I think, ahead of the regular reader or voter in terms of the amount of attention that climate change is getting. I feel a little like held back from writing again about climate. And I think a lot of journalists feel that way. That just doesn't get the resonance that inflation does, for example.
I don't
Because I think it's seen as
Americans are wired for that kind of long-term thinking.
I think it's seen as a luxury issue.
Right.
People are concerned more about the day-to-day, and unless it has a direct impact on their quality of life today, it's seen as sort of one of those luxury issues. Oh, we can think about it tomorrow.
Right.
They're wrong, of course, but I think that's the way that it's viewed.
It certainly becomes an everyday issue when your house collapses to flooding or the parkway is shut down because of a big storm. I just want to point out something that was shared with me and I posted in the chat for folks who are interested in, especially off the question about Asian American communities in New Jersey. The Society of Professional Journalists, the New Jersey chapter, is hosting a panel about press and police relations with AAPI communities on Thursday night at William Patterson. And there's a link in the chat if you'd like to find out more about that. As we wrap up, we got about 3 minutes left. Do we have any final questions, or do any of the panelists want to make any final statements about, the prognosis or their expectations for these upcoming midterms in New Jersey specifically?
It'll be interesting to see who runs for governor out of this crop of Congress members of Congress.
Anybody else?
I guess I would just say to avoid reading too much into binary outcomes. I think there is a strong human instinct to build narratives based on a handful of results, but these are tight races. They're going to be decided by probably, smallish margins. And I think there's a tendency to say, this demonstrates that blank. And I think we want to be careful about that and think more about the sort of longer term arcs that are happening here in terms of where shifts in certain voter groups are going, what kinds of issues are really driving voter behavior, and what are the real experience of the idiosyncratic human beings who make up this broad thing that we describe as the electorate.
I guess I would just say, let's not get too dispirited, because as scary as these times are, we're a better country than we were 50 years ago and 20 years ago.
Thank you, Tom.
And hopefully that'll continue when we get through this.
How about
storm.
5 years ago? How about 6 years ago? We better we were 6
Yeah,
years
no, I don't
ago.
want to talk about that.
Yeah.
Dr.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that as we approach 2026, that we'll have a sort of come to reckoning with who we are and what we are, and that these next 2-3 elections, that we will focus a little bit more on what is supposed to be our heritage, and that we can right some of this apathy and some of the wrong that has been done. I'm an optimist, and I'm hoping that we can use the birthday of the country to kind of take stock of who we are and what we are, and that some of this will touch our politicians and others in power, and that we'll get back on the right track again.
Yeah, wonderful thought.
So real quick, I just want to, anybody who's on this call who's wants to use any of this for any articles they're writing, we are going to be sending out a recording along with an audio file and a auto-generated transcript. Panelists, I am hoping that if our guests and attendees today would like to reach out to you for further comment or conversation, that we can share your email address with them. If you have one you'd like us to share, maybe your business or your booking one or whatever, please send that to me and I'll make sure to include that in the follow-up email, along with any resources or studies or anything that you'd like to include for our attendees today. Thank you again. Thank you, Tom Moran. Thank you so much for hosting. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, Peter, David, and Dr. Caldwell Epps. And thank you to everybody who
Why do they
joined.
have first names and I only have last names?
I felt
Linda,
like it would
thank
be,
you.
I feel like it'd be disrespectful to refer you as your first name because of your esteemed title. So
Oh.
We're not doctors.
I thought your first
thank you.
name was Doctor.
just the title. I'm Linda.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Linda. Thank you so much. And thank you to all you. If we will be doing another one of these events, this is going to be on climate change and solutions on Wednesday. That's tomorrow. Good Lord, we're doing two things. So check out our Twitter and our website, centerforcooperativemedia.org, where you can find links to attend that one as well. Thank you, everybody, so much, and have a great rest of the week. Enjoy this beautiful
Thank
weather.
you. Good job. Thank you.
Bye.